get comfortable. So my name is Bruce Key. I'm principal at Appnovation on the professional services side, so overlooking the delivery of our projects and working with our partners and clients. My background has been in project management and management consulting. It's my pleasure today to host the panel for the discussion on the topic of how to adopt Agile methodology in your organizations and using open technology. So today we're going to introduce three panelists. So I'm going to do a little quick introduction for everyone seated here. So first of all, to my right, if I can get my phone rolling, yeah, Mr. Brian Dahl. Brian is the Vice President of Strategy at GitHub. He has been building and selling things online since the mid-90s and has held leadership positions in both business and technical roles in the software, e-commerce, and financial services industries. So everyone, please welcome Mr. Brian Dahl.
Thank you.
And next to Brian is our very own from Appnovation, Jeff Bowman. Mr. Bowman is a senior MuleSoft engineer at Appnovation and currently leading a number of projects with a $5 billion client known as Salesforce.com. In Jeff's 25 years of software development, he helped several companies adopt Agile practices, notably Hoover, Hertz. Jeff himself is an avid open source user and have committed code to a few open source projects. So everybody please welcome Mr. Jeff Bowman.
Thank you very much.
And last but not least, and also one of our guest speakers earlier this morning, joining us is Mr. Chris Tiernan. So Chris is the Director of Software Engineering at Salesforce.com, otherwise known as SFDC. As a Director of Software Engineering for Salesforce IT, Chris is responsible for the long-term strategy and day-to-day delivery of the enterprise application integration and API practices. His passion for data and business automations has led him to champion leading-edge real-time integration platforms and develop framework to scale a high-growth multi-billion-dollar company. And Chris, I want to point out, he was one of the original teams at Salesforce when Salesforce got started. So everybody please welcome Mr. Chris Tiernan. So can everybody hear me if I stand back a little? Is the sound okay? Perfect. Thank you very much. Today, the main topic, as everyone who have seated here, let me just get a sense of, who we are here in the audience. Do we have any developers in the audience today? Development professionals, engineers? Okay, we got a couple. And project management track of professional, there we go. And business side of things, the management, there we go. Okay, more hands, great, thank you very much. So as probably all of us know here, and especially for myself, coming from project management background, Agile has always been a very hot, debated topic. So when someone says Agile, it usually means something very specific to that person. And depending on the organization that you are working with and your own journeys in your professional career, Agile can mean many different things to us. So today I want to open the first question to the panel. When someone is saying, one of your team members saying that we're running Agile, what does it actually mean to you? And what is the definition, and how do you take that and interpret that to start the question? So I'll put the first question to Brian. Maybe you can open the floor for us.
Yeah, sure. I think we see, move this back a little bit. We see a lot of companies going through this kind of transformation, right? I think this is something that's really common, and the key driver, of course, is just getting good products out the doors, faster, and that's sort of a kind of a bread and butter thing for GitHub to help with. The two pieces there are core communication, right? I think the most important thing when we talk about Agile in general is how business teams are actually going to be working with engineering teams. That's probably the kind of the core tenet, right? So when we talk about transforming into Agile development, we think about how these teams can work together better and how we can break down those cycles. So when people are kind of frustrated with the way that engineering is happening today, it's usually that it's not maybe fast enough, they're not getting products out the door quickly. But I think most importantly is that they don't get any insight in the middle of the development process, that it's sort of requirements up front, and then a year later we get a project, right? And hopefully no one's doing that anymore. We've been kind of talking about Agile for a really, really long time, 14 years I think so far. Right. But keeping the conversation open and getting everybody on the table the same kind of language and understanding how these projects are moving forward and getting insights into the development process is really, really important. And so I think it's less about exactly how that transformation happens for everybody, but really just starting with conversations and talking.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for your insight. On the same question, maybe Jeff, you can share some of your thoughts for that question. And for those who just joined us, the first question was, what does it mean when your team says we are running Agile in your organization? Jeff?
Well, I go through this in two different spaces. The first being that it's usually an excuse not to be doing something, right? We're Agile, so we don't have to do documentation. We're Agile, we don't have to, have a process. We're Agile, which is really bizarre because Agile is, to me, a more disciplined approach to delivering that software. Having a concept of what it means to get there in 2 weeks, right? And being disciplined and sticking to it and delivering all those things. And it's not that those things are ignored, documentation in your process and things like that. It's just that they're not as valued, right? If you read the Agile Manifesto, it's more of a philosophy. So to me, Agile is a philosophy that allows you to structure a disciplined approach to delivering valuable software. And so I always combat we're Agile, we don't have to do that with, well, wait a minute. Hang on a second, you absolutely do need to do that. Let's find a way to make that work together.
Great, thanks, Jeff. It's great to get the opinion, from the development perspective coming from, the engineer. Mm-hmm. And Chris, care to share your thoughts around that?
So I'm glad to hear that you like documentation since you're working on my team. To me, I agree with Brian. I think it's a lot of communication with insight into the delivery, but also with the business. But I also think it's around transparency, right? Around not only the delivery, but how the team is operating. It gives you a lot of insight into what's working really quick, getting that feedback loop so that if it fails, you can make adjustments relatively quickly. And then not go down that path or choose a different path, right? And so that feedback loop, I think, is really key to the development process, right? In the old waterfall model, which, Salesforce was in that when I originally started and we did the transformation 10 years ago, things would, where's my requirements? And sometimes you'd build it and spend a year doing it and it didn't work. And then you're back at the drawing board. So I think my key is the transparency around what's being delivered and that feedback loop to not only the business, but developers and everybody that's a stakeholder into it. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your insights into the first question. So naturally, as Brian stated, Agile has been around for about 14 years, and a lot of companies really started embracing that in the last decades or so. And Chris mentioned about the waterfall methodology. Now, surely, there are many different interpretations. So, the second question is, how does it compare to your other forms of methodology you have used in your organization, your teams, and how do you adopt Agile into your organization or your teams from both enterprise level and also on a tactical level on a day-to-day? So maybe, Brian, you can kick us off again?
Yeah, it's funny. I was giving a talk a few months back about Agile, and I was looking up waterfall to sort of figure out where on earth this horrible idea came from. And interestingly, it's basically this principle based on just kind of standard economics, right? At the time, this is the late 50s. I think 58 was when the waterfall kind of paper was first written. Is basically this supposition that authoring software is the most expensive and time-consuming and terrible part of building products, which I'm sure in the late 50s was true, right? You had one computer, there were maybe a couple dozen people that were skilled enough to operate it, and you were essentially sharing time on the system. And so that was the very, very, very valuable resource that you had to protect, because if you wasted time there, it was sort of opportunity cost of what else you could be doing. And so it wasn't as misguided maybe as we think, because that was true protection of a very scarce resource. Now we have supercomputers in our pockets, right? So there's no such thing as sort of the scarcity of authoring software as a scarce resource. We can also look at all of the kind of DevOps tooling and processes and automation that can be added to the software process that also make that literally like not at all a time-consuming process. And so we've basically taken, software is now 1,000 times, let's say, easier to author, and the rest of the entire process can literally be automated. So we're left with what I think is the important piece, right? Is what is good to build? What do people actually need? And how do we build that in a well and sustainable way to protect the people that are working on it, to make sure that it's what our customers need, that we're getting insights not just from the business but our end consumers, and make a constant feedback cycle of continuous improvement. So I think that's sort of the big kind of challenge, is looking at this almost economically, like where can we spend our time and do the valuable work rather than what was before perceived as really the difficult work.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And maybe Chris can kick us off on this second question as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I think as you make the transition and make the adoption, there's a lot of there's Scrum and there's the mechanics of following that methodology. But how do you increase business value? And a lot of it is around continuous delivery and continuous integration, where you can automate a lot of the manual, mundane tasks that take up a lot of time, and allow developers and the business to focus on the business value or the features, and get those out the door quickly in smaller iterations. So I think we've, if you subscribe to the extreme programming methodology, that has a lot of the pair programming versus automation around using tools like GitHub or Jenkins or Nexus to manage that process. But I think there's the methodology, right, and then there's some practical tools and things you can turn into operationalized Scrum to make it much more effective.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And Jeff, if you care to share about your insights around this, especially coming from the development, the technical track of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One thing that, at least culturally, right, for me, the developers I've been around, we exist on caffeine, right? So attention span is so important. And when we're looking at a project from a big scale and we're trying to figure out how am I going to get there from here, we've got this project, it's planned for a year, I can't even think that big, right? That doesn't even make sense to me. So having some of these processes and these tools that some of these guys have talked about, they just make things so much simpler for me to keep my attention on that 2-week delivery cycle. What can I give you right now? Because as a developer, there's very little that's much more rewarding than seeing my tests turn green and that they work and I'm delivering software and it's valuable. It went from nothing, a blank page, to wow, it's working and it does this cool thing now. And that's kind of important to me. So it gives me a sense of being successful and validating the work that I do, which in some companies is kind of underappreciated because their primary business isn't software, right? The primary business is insurance or the travel industry or whatever the case is. But underpinned by that is all this development. So these agile practices that we put into place sort of give me a place to feel validated that I'm delivering something valuable to the success of the company.
Great, thank you very much. That's great insights. Thanks, Jeff. Now, Agile being in the market or in the community for the last 1.5 decade now, and there's a great adaptation. So now in the recent years, as the open technology community started to really burst onto the scene, so to speak, the adoption of open technology, open source software are really infiltrating every corner of the enterprise world. Hence the conference here from Appnovation's Accelerate. Now, maybe the next question is a little bit more related to the open technology adoption in your organizations. Can you share with us a little bit insight about your use of open technology in your enterprise and your teams, and how that may or may not is also an option, have helped the adoption of Agile methodology in your teams and in your day-to-day operations. So, Brian, would you care to kick us off again?
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy for us to talk to probably every company in the world and talk about all the open source technologies that are already being used, right? So no one's probably writing their own database server right now, programming language or framework. There's certainly a lot to choose from, and this is sort of where all the most innovative and kind of forward-thinking technologies are born. And so as we start adopting those technologies in all sorts of enterprise environments, I think what tends to follow is really just being kind of impressed with how fast these projects move along, how they benefit from the community, how they're taking in feedback and advice from all these different companies that are using these projects, and they really start to realize, like, wow, this is like a way better building software. Like, maybe we should do that too. And so a lot of companies that we end up talking to are not only adopting a ton of open source software, but they're trying to figure out how those kinds of workflows should work internally for them as well, right? Because this is proven to be, kind of a faster, better way of working. Just to give you some numbers, I mean, it's kind of astonishing to me. So there's about 30 million there's 30 million projects on GitHub today, and we see about 35 million people a month that are interested in those projects. And so that's it's pretty nuts that it's like the 86th most visited website on the internet, and it just has software on it, right? So that kind of proves out that obviously companies in every corner of the world are very, very compelled and very interested in these kind of technologies, and I think the workflows follow right behind.
Great. Chris or Jeff, care to share your thoughts?
I'm a big fan of open source stuff. I remember I brought it in one day to my boss and said, hey, let's do this. This is really cool. Here's this neat piece of software. And he said, where's the purchase order? And I'm like, I'll write you one and you can pay me. How's that? That'll work, right?
Referral fee, I like that.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like, no, totally no. And from that day to now, where we look at a piece of software and go, that does 90% of what I want. It would just be better if it did that. And I pick up the source code and look at it and go, aha, and make a couple changes and submit it. And now I've got something that works for me, and I've donated something back to the bigger organization, the global internet, right? Other people who would use it. And so for me, that has been the thing that has helped adopt Agile practices, is because when we run into a speed bump that says, doggone it, Pivotal Tracker is just doggone cool, and it used to be open source, but it just doesn't do this. And so we could donate code back to that. And now we win, and now everybody else wins, and the boss goes, oh yeah, okay, well, we'll continue to use that product because it's an open source tool, and we can deliver something back, and we can continue to use it. Never mind the total cost of ownership goes down, right? So from a developer perspective, right, my thing is I can fix it, or I can improve it, right? And this is what, when I become more productive because of the tool that I'm using because I just fixed it or just improved it in some way, it's easier for me to go to my boss and say, hey, I'd really like to continue using this particular product because it now works for me the way that I want it to. And that's often a big win.
Great, yeah. I hope, none of my team comes to me and want to sell me the open license for adopting the software.
We'll talk later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. And Chris?
Yeah, I would say, coming from a development background, I agree with you, Jeff, but now that I have the management hat on, I don't want, my worry is supportability, right? And making sure that we're not tinkering around with a ton of open source projects that have a small following, right? So I think you have to take a look at, the maturity of the code base of the open source project. the following around it, what kind of contributions are going to it. I know GitHub's really good about providing those metrics and visibility to that. So that's one thing I think about when we adopt stuff. And then there's kind of the cream of the crop open source projects out there, like Jenkins and we use RabbitMQ and those things that are really highly adopted out there and really robust and have been through a rigorous open source community of changes. And so those are the kind of things I look for. So it's a little bit of a balancing act from my perspective to make sure that we're choosing the right open source technology.
Just on that point, I think, Chris, you just struck a chord there a little bit around control. So I think, in the first question we were talking about what does it mean to you when your team says we're running Agile, and I think, one of the antithesis is that it doesn't mean that we don't control things. Agile means actually there's still a control element in place. So just very quickly, if I may, elaborate on that question. So how do you insert control, in your Agile environment and making sure that the team is actually operating to your requirements or user stories and the backlogs, in this kind of open technology kind of setting?
So what we've done is basically automate the entire definition of done. If you're familiar with Scrum and Agile, it's basically a contract to say, these are all the things that need to be done in order for you to check in that code. That means documentation is up to date. You've got your code comments in there. You've upgraded, the WSDL or the connector. So it's a way to kind of say, in order to be done with this feature, these are all the things that need to be done. Automated testing needs to be, unit testing needs to be 80%. Code coverage, all the end-to-end tests need to be 80% test case coverageable and automated. And so having that automated into a pipeline helps that delivery process. And you can use a lot of open source tools to do that. Right. So.
Right. Any other thoughts to add to that from the panel?
The last company that I worked for, we ran into an issue on one of our with a defect in Mule, right? We were going to continue to use Mule; it wasn't going to change, but we ran into this bump in the road, right? And one of the nice things about the open sourceness of Mule at the time, for that specific version, was I just logged a bug and then I went in and fixed it, and then I submitted a pull request, and now that got fixed, right? I think that's another way to maintain control, right? You have control. You're not at the whim of necessarily the company that you're looking for supportability from, but you also have developers internally who can look at that and say, I think I can fix this. This is exactly where it is, and I can do this, which gives you quicker turnaround time in that space when you need to have that bug fixed, right? We need this. We can't wait for Mule to get it off of their backlog and go, yeah, we'll fix that particular thing. We need it now. This is crashing all of our servers, or we're losing data, or it's a big problem for us. So having the open source ability to jump in there and fix that thing, I think is a win too, from a control perspective.
That's a good point.
Yeah, actually, kind of one additional point there, I think, that's really important about that kind of contract and that kind of environment where you say, hey, there's this other project that I'm using, and I actually can fix my own problem, right? There's this whole sort of concept called insourcing, which is sort of similar to this, right? So we're talking about open source technologies, which is a broader community concept, right? But when we talk about insourcing, it's a little bit more delicate for a lot of companies to start opening up the source code across their business, right? That it's a lot of times it's business line specific, or just this particular team that can see, and it's kind of very access controlled, where I think there's a tremendous amount of advantage, and especially with API clients are kind of the perfect example of this, where you've got other business lines that are dependent on software that your team works on, right? And you work for the same company. Let me fix this thing, right? It's not a big deal. And so, but it can be really, really tough, I think, for companies to think about this, because the previous generation of tools made that a lot more difficult. And so now, I think that there are a lot of a lot of things we can kind of absorb from the open source community and start applying them even to internal private software development, and be a little bit more open about sharing code across teams, not just for reuse, not just for kind of exposure, but to allow a greater number of engineers across the organization to actually fix the things that they depend on. I think that exact same use case applies internally as well.
Or innovate, right? So they can,
Yeah.
you know, they can innovate off the code that someone else has already done and build upon that. So yeah, absolutely. It's a good point.
Actually, that's a great segue to the final question to the panel. As an organization grows and innovates and be creative and adopt the Agile methodology, and in this transition, and especially in the long term, in the long run, how do open technologies assist in this transition for your organizations, or in your opinion? Maybe I'll kick it off with Chris on this one.
What was the question?
How do open technologies assist in this transition in the long run for the organization?
We'll let Jeff speak to that first.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool. This is actually the question I look forward to. So I was helping a company start their Agile transformation, right? And the key thing there was buy-in, right? Top to bottom, bottom to top. Everybody had to be on the same page, agree that this is the direction the company is going to move, and this is the process we're going to use, and this is the definition of that process. And then what happens with open technology is that each team then is empowered to put up their own, whatever that might be, right? In our particular case, it meant that we had our own build server, or which is our own continuous development, continuous integration server that we had. We had our own branch off of Subversion. We did all of our radiators. All the tests are green, or some aren't. That were packaged around our team, and it made it easy for us to do, and it made it easy for every other team to do, because from an open source perspective, it was very easy to just say, well, I'm going to use this, and I don't necessarily have to ask for a whole bunch of permission because it's not costing anybody any money. It made it easy for us to adopt the Agile practices because it was not in the way, right? It wasn't a barrier to entry. If anything, it facilitated the Agile adoption because everybody got on the same page with, well, we're going to do it this way, and here's a tool that will help you, right? And so I could actually implement that on my team very easily, but it wasn't in the way of the process. It facilitated the process being adopted. So I think that was one key element for us. Besides, management buying in and saying, yeah, we're going to be Agile, and this is the way we're going to do it. And this is the person who's training everybody to do it the one way.
I don't sound that way.
Not
Me neither.
So anyway, but that gave us the opportunity then to use those tools to not have the process hijacked by, well, we can't do it because this thing doesn't work that way. Everything facilitated the Agile process in that space, and using open technologies made it easier for adoption, I think, on that company.
Yeah, I think, as arguably every company in the world is adopting more and more open technologies in their organization, I think that it really encourages them to start contributing back, not just to the individual projects, but also sort of more about what they're doing, right? So, for me, what's been really great to see are all of the sort of integrations that people are building, all the tools that we're talking about here. There was maybe one of them, right, 5 or 8 years ago in each of these kind of categories. We stand on the shoulders of giants, right? No one thinks about the operating system anymore, or the database, or the language, or the framework. These are all just things that we just know we can just sort of grab off a shelf and start working with. And now, you mentioned RabbitMQ. These are unbelievably difficult and complicated pieces of software that are just there, right? And they're well used by lots of organizations in unbelievably high scale environments. The computing environment today, we've never seen anything like this before, right? We're managing companies with, terabytes of data a day, with, hundreds of millions of customers all over the world interacting at the same time, right? There's 4 billion connected people on the planet, right? We can't do that without the open source technologies that exist. It's literally the only thing standing the internet up, right? Are these open technologies. And so I think what's encouraging is just that people have taken from the community and then starting to give back about exactly how they do this stuff. Patterns of working together, patterns of, build packs of integrations that they always use on projects. You kind of mentioned sort of the, information radiators and all these kinds of things, right? Like a GitHub project today, if you've ever worked on one of the 30 million software projects on GitHub, you know how they all work. And so immediately it's like, cool, I can just now go work for any company in the world and kind of just get that same kind of experience. And so I think we're kind of making the stuff that used to be difficult really, really easy, so we can focus on the stuff that is hard, right? Which is like making customers happy and shipping good software.
Yeah, what's interesting is we're talking about the transformation of for companies to Agile, and we mentioned there's developers out there coding on their own. I hire a lot of college graduates. They expect that kind of stuff out of companies, right? They're the ones already working in GitHub and have their own repositories. I mean, I haven't seen a resume in a long time that does not have a URL to GitHub with their code base that I can go through. So they're used to having people review their code, having openness, getting feedback right away, and working with these tools and incorporating into their code base. So, I think it's as we evolve here in software development and engineering, I think the new crop of developers and engineers coming are expecting that and can adopt it extremely fast. So
great. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for the formal questions, and we have a